Rain lashed against the windshield of Jasmine's car with relentless force, a cacophony of water and wind that made it nearly impossible to see the road ahead. Her fingers gripped the steering wheel so tightly her knuckles had turned white, the leather beneath her palms slick with sweat despite the chill that crept into the vehicle. The storm had come out of nowhere. One moment, she was cruising along the coastal highway with the lights of the city still visible in the distance. And the next, the world had turned to chaos. Thunder cracked like gunfire, the sound reverberating through her chest, and she flinched as a jagged streak of lightning split the sky. Come on, she muttered under her breath, leaning forward in a futile attempt to see through the sheets of rain. Her GPS had given up minutes ago, the signal lost in the storm's fury, leaving her with no sense of direction. All she knew was that she couldn't stay on the road much longer. It was too dangerous. Her heart pounded as she searched desperately for a sign, any sign of shelter. A flash of light in the distance caught her attention, not the cold electric slash of lightning, but something steady, rhythmic. A beacon. She squinted through the rain, her pulse quickening as the shape of a lighthouse emerged through the gloom. Perched on the edge of the rocky cliffs, relief surged through her, pushing aside the rising panic. She didn't know if anyone would be there, but at this point she didn't care. Shelter was shelter. The turnoff to a narrow gravel road appeared just in time, and she guided the car onto it, wincing at the jarring crunch under her tires. The path was treacherous, winding and uneven, but the lighthouse grew closer with every painstaking moment. Finally, she skidded to a stop in a small clearing, the beam of her headlights illuminating the base of the towering structure. Jasmine threw open the door and stepped out into the storm, immediately drenched to the bone. The wind whipped her long, dark hair into her face as she grabbed her bag from the passenger seat, clutching it tightly against her chest. Inside, her sheet music, the culmination of months of preparation, was wrapped in layers of plastic, but even that felt insufficient against the deluge. She broke into a run, her heels slipping on the slick ground as she made her way to the lighthouse. The door was old and weathered, its paint peeling from years of exposure to the elements. She pounded on it with her fist, her voice barely audible over the howling wind. "Hello? Is anyone there? Please, I need help." For a moment, there was nothing but the roar of the storm. Then she heard it, the faint creak of footsteps, cautious and deliberate, on the other side of the door. The sound was both a relief and a cause for alarm. What kind of person might be waiting for her in a place like this, isolated and foreboding? But there was no time to second-guess herself. The door swung open, and warm, golden light spilled out into the night, casting a long shadow across the threshold. Jasmine blinked against the sudden brightness, her breath hitching as she took in the man standing before her. He was tall, with dark, unruly curls and a lean, graceful frame. His shirt was loose at the collar, the sleeves rolled up to reveal strong forearms dusted with paint. His eyes, sharp and curious, swept over her, taking in her soaked dress, the wild tangle of her hair, the frantic grip she had on her bag. "You look like you've had better days," he said, his voice low and edged with amusement. Jasmine bristled, though she wasn't sure if it was from the cold or his tone. "Is that really what you're going with right now? Can I come in, or should I just stand here and drown?" He held up his hands in mock surrender, stepping aside to let her in. "I suppose I can spare a dry spot. Welcome to my humble abode." She stepped inside, grateful for the warmth, though her irritation flared at his nonchalant attitude. The interior was rustic but inviting, with mismatched furniture and books stacked precariously on every available surface. A fire crackled in the hearth, casting flickering shadows across the room. As the door closed behind her, muting the storm's fury, Jasmine turned to face the stranger. "Thank you," she said, her tone clipped but sincere. "Sorry for barging in like this. I didn't have much of a choice." He shrugged, a crooked smile playing on his lips. "No one ends up here by choice. I'm Adrian, by the way." "Jasmine," she replied, brushing a strand of hair out of her eyes. "And if you don't mind, I just need a minute to figure out what I'm doing." Adrian leaned casually against the wall, watching her with an unreadable expression. "Take your time. Something tells me you're not going anywhere tonight." Jasmine glanced at the window, where the rain continued to pound against the glass. He was right, of course. For better or worse, she was stuck here. Adrian leaned against the kitchen counter, a steaming mug of tea cradled casually in his hands as Jasmine paced the length of the room, dripping water onto the scuffed wooden floor. The lighthouse interior was surprisingly cozy, though cramped, more lived in than she'd expected, with its patchwork of rugs and walls adorned with an eclectic mix of paintings and sketches. She tried not to focus on the wet squelch of her shoes or the way Adrian's amused gaze followed her every movement. "So, opera singer, huh?" he said, breaking the silence with a lilt of curiosity. His tone was light, teasing, the kind of tone that made her shoulders stiffen instinctively. Jasmine stopped mid-step and fixed him with a sharp look. "I didn't say I was an opera singer." Adrian raised an eyebrow, unbothered. "You didn't have to. The way you keep clutching that bag like it holds the crown jewels kind of gave it away. Sheet music, right?" Her grip tightened on the damp satchel hanging from her shoulder. She hated how easily he'd read her, but the storm outside had frayed her nerves too much for her to muster more than a clipped response. "Yes, sheet music, for a very important performance." "And you're what? Worried it's going to melt?" He tilted his head, his dark curls falling into his eyes as he smirked. "Pretty sure paper doesn't do that." Jasmine shot him a glare. "It's not just paper. It's months of preparation, hours upon hours of work that could be ruined if I don't dry it out properly." She exhaled sharply, her irritation bubbling to the surface. "Not that it's any of your business." Adrian regarded her for a moment, then shrugged with an air of practiced indifference. "Fair enough." He sipped his tea, eyes twinkling over the rim of the mug. "But for the record, you might want to worry less about your sheet music and more about hypothermia. You're still shivering." Jasmine looked down at herself, realizing too late how soaked and disheveled she must appear. Her dress clung uncomfortably to her skin, and her arms were dotted with goosebumps. Great, she thought bitterly. Just what I needed, fashion advice from a lighthouse hermit. "I'll be fine," she said, her voice tight. "Once I dry out my things, I'll get out of your way." Adrian chuckled softly, setting down his mug. "Sure, because the roads are so inviting right now." He gestured toward the small window where rain streaked the glass in relentless waves. "Face it, Jasmine, you're stuck here with me. Might as well make the best of it." She folded her arms across her chest, ignoring the faint tremor in her hands. "And what exactly does make the best of it mean?" "Oh, I don't know." He leaned against the counter again, his posture loose, unhurried. "You could stop pacing holes in my floor, for starters. Maybe even sit down and have some tea. Or, wild idea, actually let yourself relax for 5 minutes." Relax? The word came out sharper than she intended. I'm stranded in the middle of a storm, miles away from where I'm supposed to be, with no way of knowing if my career is about to go up in flames. Forgive me if I'm not in the mood for a cozy night in. Adrian's smile softened, his teasing edge fading just enough to surprise her. "Hey, I get it," he said gently. "You're under a lot of pressure. That much is obvious." He hesitated, then added with a hint of humor, "But stressing yourself into an early grave isn't going to help your music, or anything else for that matter." Jasmine opened her mouth to retort, but something in his tone gave her pause. For the first time since she'd arrived, he didn't sound like he was mocking her. Instead, there was an undercurrent of understanding, as if he recognized the weight she was carrying. Against her better judgment, curiosity began to replace her irritation. "And you're an expert on handling pressure, I suppose?" she asked, her voice less combative now. Adrian gave a short laugh. "Not exactly, but I do know what it's like to get so wrapped up in proving something to yourself or to other people that you forget why you started in the first place." He gestured toward the walls, where dozens of paintings hung alongside framed photographs of dancers mid-leap. "I work in the art world. It's not exactly stress-free." Jasmine glanced at the artwork, then back at him. "You're an artist?" "Curator," he corrected. "Mostly. Sometimes I paint, but—" He trailed off, his expression growing distant. "Let's just say I'm more of a dancer than anything these days." Her eyes narrowed. "A dancer who lives alone in a lighthouse?" Adrian grinned at her skepticism. "It's a long story, but don't worry, I'm not a serial killer or anything. I save my big existential crises for the canvas." Despite herself, a reluctant smile tugged at the corners of Jasmine's mouth. The absurdity of it all, the storm, the lighthouse, this infuriatingly cheeky stranger, was starting to chip away at her defenses. She still didn't know what to make of Adrian, but for the first time since she'd arrived, she felt the smallest flicker of calm. "Well," she said, stepping closer to the fire, "I'd settle for some dry clothes right now. Got any of those lying around, or do I have to keep pacing holes in your floor?" Adrian pushed off the counter, his grin widening. "I think I can manage that. Try not to get into too much trouble while I'm gone." And with that, he disappeared up the staircase, leaving her alone with the crackling fire and the faintest trace of warmth spreading through her chest. Jasmine knelt on the threadbare rug in front of the fireplace, her bag open and its contents spread out around her in a chaotic mess. The flickering light caught on the edges of plastic sleeves and warped pages, casting shadows that danced along the uneven floorboards. Her brow furrowed deeply as she carefully peeled back another damp sheet of music, her fingers trembling with a mix of urgency and frustration. The edges of the paper curled inward, darkened by the water that had seeped through. She muttered under her breath, sharp and clipped, though the words were too quiet to catch. Adrian stood a few feet away, leaning against the edge of a low bookcase. His arms were crossed over his chest, a faint smile tugging at his lips as he observed her. She was so focused, so intent on rescuing each piece of music that she didn't seem to notice him watching. The firelight highlighted the delicate lines of her profile, the curve of her cheek, the determined set of her jaw, the way her damp hair clung to her neck. There was something mesmerizing about her, though he couldn't quite put his finger on it. When she finally let out an audible groan of frustration, Adrian decided to break the silence. "You know," he said, his voice low and teasing, "I didn't realize I'd invited a pyromaniac into my lighthouse. You're not going to toss all that into the fire, are you?" Jasmine's head snapped up, her glare sharp enough to cut glass. "I'll have you know," she bit out, holding up one of the pages for emphasis, "that this is the culmination of months of work. It's not just paper. It's my life." Adrian raised his hands in mock surrender, though the smile on his face didn't waver. All right. No need to incinerate me with your death glare. I was just making an observation." She huffed, her attention snapping back to the music in front of her. One by one, she arranged the pages closer to the fire, careful not to let them get too close to the flames. "If you're not going to help, at least don't distract me," she muttered. Adrian tilted his head, curiosity gleaming in his eyes. "What exactly are you trying to do? Dry it out?" "Yes," she said shortly, her hands continuing their meticulous work. "And if you have any better ideas, I'm all ears." He pushed off the bookcase and took a step closer, crouching down beside her. "You're going about it all wrong," he said casually, as if it were the most obvious thing in the world. She shot him a sidelong glance, her patience wearing dangerously thin. "Oh, really? Enlighten me, then." He didn't answer right away. Instead, he reached for one of the warped pages she'd set aside, holding it up to the light. He studied it for a moment before gently setting it back down. "You're just going to make it worse by putting it so close to the fire. The heat will dry it unevenly, and the pages will crinkle even more." Jasmine froze, her fingers hovering over the next sheet of music. She hated to admit it, but he might have a point. Still, her pride wouldn't let her acknowledge it outright. "So what am I supposed to do? Let it air dry for the next 3 days? I don't exactly have that kind of time." Adrian's lips twitched into a grin, as if he could sense her reluctance to concede. "No, but you could try copying it down." She blinked, turning to face him fully now. "Copy it down? By hand? Are you insane?" "Relax." He reached into his back pocket and pulled out a small leather-bound notebook. The edges of the cover were scuffed, and a faded elastic band held it closed. "Use this," he said simply, holding it out to her. "It's not much, but it's better than losing everything." Jasmine stared at the notebook as if it were a foreign object. "I can't use that," she said, her tone defensive. "It's yours." "And I'm offering it to you," Adrian replied, his voice calm but insistent. "Unless you've got another option, which, judging by your current strategy, I'm guessing you don't." She looked back at the scattered pages in front of her, then at the notebook in his hand. "What about you? Don't you need it?" Adrian shrugged. his dark eyes meeting hers with an openness that caught her off guard. Not as much as you do right now. For a moment, the only sounds in the room were the crackle of the fire and the relentless howl of the storm outside. Jasmine hesitated, her fingers twitching toward the notebook before pulling back again. She wasn't used to people offering her help, not without some kind of ulterior motive, but there was something about the way Adrian held her gaze, something steady and unflinching, that made her want to trust him. Finally, she reached out and took the notebook from his hand. The leather was warm and worn, the pages inside thick and inviting. She ran her thumb along the edge of the cover before glancing back at him. "Thank you," she said quietly, the words taking more effort than she expected. Adrian grinned, rocking back on his heels. "Don't mention it. Just don't blame me if my handwriting throws you off. I'm not exactly fluent in music notation." The corner of her mouth twitched, a reluctant smile threatening to break through. "I think I'll manage," she said, flipping open the notebook to the first blank page. He stood and stepped back, giving her space to work. "Good. I'll leave you to it then. But if you need anything, say, a crash course in not being so stubborn, you know where to find me." Jasmine rolled her eyes, but there was no real heat behind it. As she bent over the notebook, carefully transcribing the first few notes of her ruined sheet music, she felt a small weight lift from her chest. The storm still raged outside, and her future was as uncertain as ever. But for the first time since she'd arrived, she didn't feel entirely alone. The fire had settled into a steady, comforting crackle, its warmth seeping into the air around them. Jasmine sat cross-legged on the floor, Adrian's notebook in her lap, the faint scratch of her pen filling the lulls between the storm's howls outside. She was focused, her head bent over the tiny, precise notes she was copying, her lips moving occasionally as she hummed a melody under her breath. Across the room, Adrian lounged in a faded armchair, one leg draped over the side, a sketchpad balanced on his knee. His hand moved fluidly across the page, pausing every so often as he glanced up at her with quiet intensity. Neither of them had spoken in nearly 20 minutes, the silence between them surprisingly unstrained. It was a truce of sorts, Jasmine thought, a fragile but welcome reprieve from the snarky remarks they'd exchanged earlier. She finished copying the last measure of a particularly intricate aria and set the pen down, flexing her cramped fingers. Leaning back, she let out a long sigh and tilted her head to look at Adrian. "Do you always make a habit of sketching your unexpected guests?" she asked, her tone light but curious. She nodded toward the page he was working on, though she couldn't quite see what he'd drawn from where she was sitting. Adrian's lips twitched, his pencil pausing mid-stroke. "Only the ones who barge into my lighthouse during a thunderstorm and threaten to ruin my floorboards," he replied without missing a beat. "You've got good energy, though. Sharp lines, bold angles." "Is that supposed to be a compliment?" she asked, arching an eyebrow. "Depends. Are you fishing for one?" he shot back, grinning. Jasmine rolled her eyes, but her lips curved into a faint smile despite herself. "You're insufferable, you know that?" "Frequently told," Adrian said with a mock bow from his chair, "but you didn't deny the energy part, so I'll take that as a win." She shook her head, but her gaze lingered on him a moment longer, curiosity tugging at her. There was something about him, beneath the smirks and casual charm, that intrigued her, though she couldn't quite pinpoint what it was yet. "What are you sketching anyway?" she asked, gesturing toward the pad in his lap. He hesitated, his grin softening into something more subdued. "Just impressions," he said vaguely, turning the pad toward her. On the page was a rough, charcoal rendering of the room's interior, the firelight spilling across the wooden floor, her sheet music scattered like fragile leaves, the curve of her shoulders as she worked. The lines were loose, almost unfinished, but they carried a sense of movement and life that made the image feel strangely intimate. Jasmine stared at it for a moment, taken aback. "You drew that? Just now?" she asked, glancing between him and the sketch. Adrian shrugged, looking almost shy for the first time since she'd met him. "It's nothing fancy, just a quick study helps me focus." "It's beautiful," she said quietly, surprising herself with the sincerity in her voice. He met her eyes then, something unspoken passing between them. The room felt smaller, the storm outside a distant hum. "Thanks," he said after a beat, his voice low. "But it's not exactly the Sistine Chapel." "I don't think it needs to be," she replied, her brow furrowing slightly. "It's honest. I like that." Adrian tilted his head, studying her with a newfound intensity. Coming from someone who pours their soul into music, that means a lot. She blinked, caught off guard by the sudden weight in his words. "How do you know I pour my soul into it?" she asked, her tone more defensive than she intended. "Because I can see it," he said simply, leaning forward now, his elbows resting on his knees. "The way you hold on to that music like it's the only thing keeping you afloat. The way you hum under your breath without even realizing it. You're not just doing it because you're good at it, you're doing it because it's a part of you." Jasmine stared at him, her chest tightening. It wasn't often that someone saw through her so easily, and she wasn't sure whether to feel flattered or exposed. "You sound like you've been watching too many inspirational movies," she said, deflecting with a weak attempt at humor. Jasmine lingered in the small kitchen of the lighthouse, her fingers brushing over the edge of Adrian's notebook, now partially filled with her meticulous transcriptions. The storm outside had begun to taper, its violent rage dwindling to an almost gentle patter of rain against the windows. The fire in the living room crackled faintly, and the space felt uncharacteristically still, save for the faint hum of Adrian's voice coming from upstairs. She hadn't meant to eavesdrop. Not really. But the lighthouse was small, and sound carried easily through its narrow stairwell. She had only come into the kitchen to refill her glass of water when she caught the cadence of his words, the low, lilting rhythm of his voice muffled by the old wooden walls. It wasn't the casual banter she'd grown accustomed to from him, though. This was different, sharper, detached. Jasmine froze, glass forgotten in her hand, as snippets of his conversation drifted down the stairs. "No, she's fine. A bit intense, though. You know the type. Obsessed with being perfect." His laughter was soft but biting, and Jasmine felt it like a pinprick to her chest. "I swear, if you heard her talk about it, you'd think she was carrying the weight of the entire opera world on her shoulders." Her grip tightened around the glass, the cool condensation dampening her fingers. He was talking about her. There was no mistaking it. "Yeah, I know. Classic tortured artist syndrome," Adrian continued, his tone light but laced with something that sounded dangerously close to condescension. "She's got this whole high-stakes make-or-break thing going on. It's almost comical. Like, calm down. It's just music." Jasmine's heart thudded in her chest, each word tightening the coil of humiliation and anger in her stomach. She felt as though the air had been punched out of her lungs. Bitterness rising to the back of her throat. Just music. Was that what he thought of her? Of the thing she'd poured her entire soul into? The thing she'd sacrificed sleep, relationships, and any semblance of a normal life for? Her chest burned, heat rising to her face as Adrian's voice trailed off into a murmur, too quiet for her to make out now. The storm outside, once a source of chaos and danger, suddenly felt preferable to the suffocating weight blooming inside her chest. She set the glass down on the counter with a sharp clink, her movements stiff, her thoughts racing. She needed to get out of this room, needed space to think, before she said something she couldn't take back. She didn't hear Adrian's footsteps until they were almost at the bottom of the stairs. He rounded the corner into the kitchen, phone in hand, his expression relaxed but distracted. He stopped when he noticed her, a flicker of curiosity crossing his face. "Hey," he said, slipping the phone into his pocket. "I was just talking to—" "Don't," Jasmine interrupted, her voice low and clipped. She turned to face him fully now, her arms crossed tightly over her chest like armor. "I heard enough." Adrian's brow furrowed, confused. "What are you?" "I said don't," she snapped, her words slicing through the air between them. The hurt she'd been trying to suppress boiled to the surface, sharp and unforgiving. "I can't believe I actually thought." She stopped herself, shaking her head as if to clear the thought. "You know what? Forget it." "Whoa, hold on," Adrian said, his hands lifting in a gesture of defense. "What's going on? What did you hear?" Jasmine let out a bitter laugh, the sound foreign even to her own ears. "Oh, don't play dumb, Adrian. Classic tortured artist syndrome, obsessed with being perfect, or my personal favorite, it's just music." She shot the last phrase at him like a dagger, her voice trembling despite her best efforts to hold it steady. Adrian's face fell, his usual easy confidence replaced with something closer to alarm. "Jasmine, that's not—" "Save it," she cut him off, her eyes narrowing. "I guess I shouldn't be surprised. You've been mocking me since the moment I walked through that door. Why would this be any different?" He took a step toward her, his hands still raised, placating. "You're twisting this," he said, his voice calm but urgent. "That conversation wasn't what you think it was." "Oh, really?" she said, her voice rising now, her anger spilling over the edges of her composure. "Then what was it, Adrian? Enlighten me, because from where I'm standing, it sounds a lot like you think everything I've worked for, everything I've sacrificed, is just some overblown joke." Adrian flinched at the venom in her words, his jaw tightening. "That's not fair," he said evenly, though the strain in his voice was evident. "You don't know the context." "I don't need context," she shot back. "I heard enough to know exactly what you think of me." "No, you don't," he insisted, his own frustration beginning to seep through. "You heard a fraction of a conversation that wasn't even about tearing you down. I was talking to an old friend, someone who what, needed a laugh at my expense," she interrupted. "God, I can't believe I thought you actually understood, that we were actually starting to." She stopped herself again, choking on the words. She couldn't even bring herself to say it. Whatever fragile connection had been forming between them felt shattered now, irreparable. Adrian opened his mouth to respond, but she didn't give him the chance. Turning abruptly, she snatched her bag from the counter and stormed toward the living room. She didn't know where she was planning to go. It wasn't like she could drive off into the storm, but she couldn't stand to be in the same room as him for another second. "Jasmine," Adrian called after her, his voice tinged with exasperation. "Would you just stop for a second? Let me explain." She whirled around to face him, her eyes blazing. "I don't need your explanations, Adrian. Just stay out of my way." And with that, she disappeared into the living room, the sound of her footsteps echoing against the floorboards. Adrian stood frozen in the kitchen, frustration and regret etched into his features as he stared after her. The rain outside continued its steady rhythm, a quiet but relentless reminder of the storm that still raged, not just beyond the lighthouse walls, but within them. The storm had softened into a persistent drizzle by the time dawn began to creep through the thick gray clouds. The lighthouse, with its weathered beams and chipped paint, seemed calmer now, as if it too had endured the worst of the tempest and was catching its breath. Outside, the waves still churned against the rocky shore, but their fury had waned, the rhythm steady and almost soothing. Adrian stood at the base of the lighthouse stairs, his arms crossed as he leaned against the banister. He watched Jasmine move hurriedly around the small living room, her focus razor-sharp as she stuffed her belongings into her bag. Her damp sheet music was now neatly tucked into a protective folder, her borrowed notebook nestled alongside it. She moved with precision, her shoulders tight, her jaw set, as if the storm inside her hadn't abated in the least. "You don't have to rush, you know," Adrian said softly, breaking the silence that had stretched between them since their argument the night before. "The roads are probably still a mess." Jasmine didn't look up. "I don't have a choice," she replied, her tone clipped. "The performance was moved up. I just got the call. If I don't leave now, I'll miss it." Adrian straightened, frowning. "Moved up? How much time do you have?" "Not enough," she muttered, zipping her bag and slinging it over her shoulder. "But I'll make it work." He watched her for a moment, his hands slipping into his pockets. She looked like she hadn't slept. Her face was pale, her hair still slightly damp, but her movements were as precise and controlled as ever. He could see the determination etched into every line of her body, the relentless drive that had carried her this far, but also the weight of it, the exhaustion that clung to her like a shadow. "Jasmine," he started, his voice careful, measured. "About last night." "Don't." She cut him off, finally turning to face him. Her eyes, though tired, still burned with the remnants of anger and hurt. "We don't have time for that. I don't have time for that." His jaw tightened, but he nodded, stepping aside as she moved toward the door. She hesitated for the briefest moment, her hand hovering over the doorknob, before glancing back at him. Thank you, she said, her voice quieter now, almost reluctant. For letting me stay. For the notebook. Adrian's lips twitched into a faint, bittersweet smile. You're welcome, he said simply. It's yours, by the way. The notebook. Keep it. Her brow furrowed, and for a moment he thought she might argue. But then she nodded, her gaze flickering to the floor. Thanks, she murmured before pulling the door open. The damp morning air rushed in, cool and sharp. Jasmine stepped out onto the slick gravel path, her heels crunching softly against the ground as she moved toward her car. Adrian followed her, keeping a few paces behind, the silence between them heavy, but not quite hostile. The car was still coated in a thin layer of mud, the tires caked from the treacherous drive the night before. Jasmine unlocked the door and threw her bag into the passenger seat, but when she turned back toward the lighthouse, she froze. Adrian was standing there, his hands shoved into the pockets of his coat, his dark curls tousled by the damp breeze. He looked at her with an expression she couldn't quite decipher, something caught between regret and resolve. Good luck, he said finally, his voice steady but low. I mean it. I hope it goes the way you want it to. Jasmine opened her mouth, then closed it again, unsure of what to say. She had been so focused on leaving, on putting as much distance as possible between herself and this place, that the sincerity in his tone caught her off guard. It shouldn't have mattered. It shouldn't have meant anything. But it did. Thanks, she said after a moment, her voice soft. I hope you figure out whatever it is you're looking for, too. Adrian tilted his head slightly, his lips curving into the faintest smile. Guess we'll see. She nodded, lingering for a heartbeat longer than she intended, before turning away and sliding into the driver's seat. The engine sputtered to life, its rumble breaking the fragile stillness. She gripped the wheel tightly, her fingers cold against the leather, and glanced once more in the rearview mirror. Adrian was still standing there, his figure framed by the lighthouse behind him, the drizzle falling softly around him. He didn't wave, didn't move. He just watched as she pulled away, the gravel crunching beneath her tires as she navigated the narrow, winding road back to the highway. The lighthouse grew smaller and smaller in her mirror until it disappeared entirely, swallowed by the mist and the cliffs and the endless gray ocean. Jasmine exhaled shakily, her chest tight, her thoughts spinning faster than the car's wheels. She should have felt relief to be moving forward, relief to have escaped the storm and everything it had dragged to the surface. But instead, all she felt was the echo of his voice, the weight of his unspoken words, and the strange hollow ache of something left unfinished. The rain had stopped entirely by the time she reached the main road, but the storm she carried with her was far from over. Adrian sat at the small wooden desk tucked in the corner of the lighthouse's living room, the surface cluttered with charcoal pencils, erasers, and a half-finished sketch of the stormy coastline. The lighthouse was quiet now, save for the faint murmur of the ocean outside and the occasional creak of the old beams as the coastal wind nudged the building. The storm had passed, but its remnants lingered in his chest, a restless, gnawing ache that had refused to let him sleep the night before. He stared down at the blank sheet of paper in front of him, the pen poised loosely between his fingers. The words churned in his mind, scattered and heavy, none of them feeling quite right. How did you explain something so simple yet so tangled? How did you apologize to someone who had every reason not to listen? With a quiet sigh, Adrian set the pen to the page and began to write, the scratch of ink filling the stillness. Jasmine, I hope this letter finds you. Though I know there's a decent chance you'll roll your eyes at seeing my name at the top and toss it straight into the trash. I wouldn't blame you for that, but I'm writing anyway because there are things I need to say. Things I should have said before you walked out of this lighthouse with that fire in your eyes and that weight on your shoulders. First, I owe you an apology. What you overheard, it came out wrong, so wrong that I can't blame you for taking it the way you did. But let me be clear, I wasn't mocking you. I wasn't mocking your music, your ambition, or the passion you carry for what you do. If anything, I was trying, poorly, as it turns out, to make sense of how much I admired it. Admired you. You're one of the most relentless, determined people I've ever met. Watching you fight to save that music, to dry each page like they were pieces of your soul, was enough to make anyone step back and realize just how much you've sacrificed to get where you are. And maybe I was too much of a coward to say it outright, but that fire in you, I envy it. When I said it's just music, that wasn't about you. It was about me. It was about my own relationship with art and how I've turned my back on it more times than I care to admit. I guess I was trying to deflect, to make a joke. Because it's easier than admitting that I've lost something I see so clearly in you. Something I can't seem to get back. But that's not fair to you. None of this is. And I hate that I made you feel like what you love isn't important or worthy, because it is. You are. I see that now in ways I couldn't fully grasp before. I don't know if this changes anything for you, I don't expect it to, but if there's even the smallest chance that we can rewrite how we left things, I'd like to try. I'd like to start again if you'll let me. The storm's over now, but I can't stop thinking about what you said before you left, about hoping I'd figure out whatever it is I'm looking for. I think I've started to, and it might be you. Yours, Adrian. Adrian set down the pen and read the letter again, his chest tightening with every word. It wasn't perfect. Nothing he ever wrote or drew or danced seemed to be, but it was honest, and maybe, just maybe, that would be enough. He folded the paper carefully, slipping it into an envelope before scrawling her name across the front in bold, deliberate letters. The rain had stopped outside, but the wind still carried a chill as Adrian stepped onto the lighthouse's front steps. He stood there for a long moment, staring out at the horizon where the sea met the sky, before turning back inside. Jasmine might never read his letter, but it was the first step toward something he hadn't done in a long time, taking a risk. Jasmine sat at her desk, the city humming faintly in the background, its incessant rhythm muted by the thick glass of her apartment window. Adrian's letter lay open in front of her, its edges slightly crumpled from where her hands had gripped it too tightly the first time she'd read it. And the second. And the third. Every word was etched into her mind, echoing louder than the aria she'd been rehearsing all morning. Her eyes fell to the bottom of the page, to the way he'd signed it. Yours, Adrian. The simplicity of it shouldn't have made her chest constrict, shouldn't have made her pulse quicken. But it did. She leaned back in her chair, the pen in her hand tapping rhythmically against the edge of a blank sheet of stationery. Words hovered just out of reach, like a melody she could hum but not yet put to music. She wasn't used to this, feeling so exposed, so uncertain about what to say. On stage, every note, every breath was deliberate, rehearsed, flawless. But here, with Adrian's letter still on her desk and her own blank page staring back at her, she felt utterly unprepared. With a slow, deliberate breath, Jasmine set her pen to the page.
Adrian.
I didn't know what to make of your letter at first. Frankly, I wasn't sure if I should respond. Part of me wanted to ignore it, to tuck it away in a drawer and pretend it didn't exist, because addressing it would mean admitting you'd gotten under my skin. And I didn't want that. I wasn't ready for that. But here I am, writing back, which I suppose says more than I'm ready to admit out loud. I've spent my entire life pushing forward, one performance at a time, one impossible dream after the next. I thought if I could just keep moving, keep achieving, nothing could catch up with me. Failure, doubt, fear. Even loneliness. Drive was my armor, and every ounce of focus I poured into my music was like a shield against the parts of my life I didn't want to look too closely at. You saw through that, though. Somehow, in just a few hours in that lighthouse, you saw the cracks I've spent years trying to hide. I hated you for that at first. You were too perceptive, too casual about truths I wasn't ready to admit to myself. And yet, you weren't wrong. There's a part of me that's been so busy proving something, to the world, to myself, that I forgot why I fell in love with music to begin with. You reminded me of that. You reminded me what it feels like to connect with something or someone in a way I haven't let myself in a long time. What I overheard in the kitchen, it hurt. You know that. But after reading your letter, I can see now that I wasn't just angry at you. I was angry at myself, because deep down, I knew some of what you said was true. I've let perfection consume me. I've let it define me. And the idea that someone might see that, might name it out loud, was terrifying. It still is. But your letter, it stayed with me. It made me think about things I've been too afraid to confront, and I think I needed that more than I realized. You said the storm may have brought us together for a reason, and maybe you're right. Maybe I needed that lighthouse, that night, more than I ever would have admitted at the time. So here I am, trying to do this whole honesty thing you seem to be so good at. I'm not sure where this will go or what any of it means right now, but I'm willing to find out, that is, if you are. Yours, Jasmine. Jasmine sat back, her heart pounding in her chest as she reread the words. It wasn't perfect. It wasn't practiced. But for once, she wasn't trying to be. She folded the letter carefully, slipping it into an envelope. As she wrote his name on the front, her hand lingered over the letters, the weight of them sinking into her chest. Adrian. It felt strange, but not unwelcome, to feel so tethered to someone she barely knew. The letter was just the beginning, she thought as she sealed the envelope. There was so much left unsaid, so many layers still to be uncovered. But for the first time in a long time, she didn't feel afraid of what might come next. Jasmine stood at the edge of the gallery, her breath catching in her throat as she scanned the room. The space was alive with murmured conversation and the soft clink of champagne glasses, the evening glow from the overhead lights casting a golden sheen on the paintings adorning the walls. But none of it mattered. Not the art, not the crowd of patrons milling about in their tailored suits and cocktail dresses. She wasn't here for them. And then she saw him. Adrian stood near the farthest wall, his posture relaxed but his eyes focused as he explained something to an older couple. His dark curls were slightly shorter than she remembered, but he still had that same easy presence, a quiet magnetism, like he belonged to the art and the space itself. He gestured to a painting, his hands moving expressively, and she noticed the faint smear of charcoal on his fingertips. Some things never changed. She hesitated, her fingers tightening around the strap of her purse. What if this was a mistake? What if the letters weren't enough to bridge the distance they'd let grow between them? But as if sensing her presence, Adrian suddenly turned, his gaze sweeping the room until it landed on her. For a moment, the world seemed to narrow to just the two of them. He excused himself from the couple, his steps unhurried but deliberate, as he crossed the space between them. When he stopped in front of her, his voice was soft, as if he were afraid to break the fragile moment. "You came. I did." Jasmine's smile trembled at the edges, her heart pounding. "I figured it was my turn to chase you for once." Adrian's lips curved into that crooked smile she'd thought about far too often. "I didn't think I'd ever see you again." "I wasn't sure either," she admitted, her voice steadier now. "But your letters, they reminded me of something I'd almost forgotten, that it's okay to want more than one thing, to want music and—" She hesitated, her courage faltering briefly. "And you." His expression softened, a flicker of vulnerability passing through his eyes. "I feel the same way," he said quietly. "You don't have to choose, Jasmine. Neither of us do." Her chest tightened, but this time it wasn't from fear. "So, what now?" Adrian's smile widened, his hand reaching out to take hers, grounding her in the moment. "We figure it out, together." For the first time in as long as she could remember, Jasmine felt the weight lift, the future before them wide open and full of promise.